So good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the U.S. Institute of Peace, and thank you all for coming this morning. I'm Lily Cole, and I direct our fellowship program here, the Jennings-Randolph Fellowship Programs, which includes both senior fellowships in residence here at the Institute and our award for predoctoral award for dissertations being written on topics related to international peace and conflict. So it's really a great pleasure today to be part of this panel to discuss a very interesting study that was carried out at the organization based in Qatar called Education Above All. And I should say that it's a particular honor to speak today on a panel with Margaret Sinclair. You all have bios, so I won't go into many details, but I would like to say that Margaret Sinclair is one of the great names in the world of education and conflict and providing education in emergencies and conflict. And I just wanted to say that this, for many people who work in the field, this book, Planning Education in and After Emergencies, it was published by UNESCO, is a kind of Bible of the field. It was my introduction to the field, and it's wonderful to be able to host Margaret here at the Institute. So briefly, she's going to tell you in detail about the project on Pedagogies for Peace. But our connection at the Institute to the project is that I met Margaret in the context of our work together in the INEE, the Interagency Network on Education in Emergencies. And the book is a collection of policy briefs. And the intersection with the Institute, the concrete intersection, is that two of us, I and Kamar, my colleague here at the Institute, have essays in the book. My essay, I'm actually not going to speak on today unless there are questions. My essay is on the reform of history education, which in many ways I'm beginning to feel is so politically difficult that it's a bit of an outlier compared to the other pedagogies that were represented in the book, and that I feel have more of a chance to be implemented, and particularly because history education reform is also apparently dependent on time and sequencing, and is so often something that can't be tackled for major reform in the close aftermath of conflict. So we're going to have Margaret here speak first on the findings of the origins of the findings of the project, and then Jeff Helsing, who is the Dean of Curriculum for the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding here at the Institute. Jeff has a long history besides being a key force in helping to build our institute. He also is an expert in post-conflict education and has done a lot of very interesting work in Palestine and Israel over the years. He's going to talk about our work here at the Institute and in the Academy. And then I'm very happy to welcome my colleague Xanthi Ackerman here today from Brookings, from the Center for Universal Education. And I have to say that she is virtually, also we'd like to claim her as a USIP, member of the USIP community here. Xanthi won one of our very prestigious peace scholarships, I believe it was 2009 to 10. For her dissertation, looking at returning refugees in northern Uganda and the role of schools and the meaning of educational services to refugees. And she has continued to work with the Institute on various projects, and is now doing extremely interesting work that she's going to talk about that Brookings is doing on the campaign to see not only education for all, but quality education for all, including for children in conflict and in conflict-affected states. So I should add that Xanthi also has a very interesting experience in having founded a foundation in Malawi to support girls' secondary school education, which has grown and is now a very well-established organization, sending, I think maybe Xanthi can tell you, the number of girls so far who have been able to get secondary school education because of the support of this foundation. and my colleague Kamar Al-Huda from our program on religion and peace building will talk to you about the work he does in education, and in particular the creation of peace curricula for madrasas, for Muslim schools, which is a very interesting and original project, I think, here at in our religion and peace building portfolio. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers, and we'll be very interested in your thoughts on this topic. So, Margaret, I'd like to turn to you to start us off.
Okay, I'll try. Thanks so much for your kind introduction and for all the work you've put into organizing this event, and also to Brookings for their support of this event. So, we're looking today at education for citizenship and peace in low-income, fragile, and post-conflict settings. And the point we're making, which we make in the book, is that we do know what to do, but we don't have the will to do it. So today we'll look at what we think should be done, see if you agree, and see if you have some ideas how we can develop the will. The book was not originally called Education for Global Citizenship. It was called Education for Global Citizenship and Peace, and we invited 17 practitioners and specialists to contribute briefs. But as you may know, the UN Secretary General launched an initiative on 26th of September, a 5-year global education initiative called Education First, which has 3 priorities: access, quality, and foster global citizenship. And the third priority is very surprising, and you don't see it in when you read books about education and development and so on as a priority, and that we understand was the personal priority of the Secretary General. So my director said, let's title the book to reflect that priority and help form an agenda for the 5 years' work under Education First. This is, to cheer us along, it's the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. Actually, this is a non-formal initiative training peer educators in peace and non-violence, which the IFRC has taken as an area of its work now. So the presentation today is structured on basically what are we talking about, what sort of themes would come under Education for Global Citizenship or Education for Citizenship and Peace, how would one do it at the micro level, in the classroom, etc., and how would one do it in policy terms. And first of all, is it fair to take cases that have been done under the label of national citizenship education or peace education and put them in a book called Education for Global Citizenship? And we think it is, because the modern trend in citizenship education is to focus on how the diverse elements in a society can cooperate to create a governable and peaceful and stable and prosperous society. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, after the Good Friday Accord, they developed something specifically called Education for Local and Global Citizenship. And the elements here are quite typical of many citizenship programs these days: diversity, inclusion, participation, human rights, etc. So obviously in Northern Ireland they didn't really like to emphasize national citizenship because they didn't particularly, some favored the UK and some favored Ireland, so they called it local and global citizenship. And the kids talk about how you get along with diversity, how you cope with diversity in your immediate environment, and then naturally the same issues come as you go to the global level. Diversity, how do you cope with it? So the content, there are many initiatives in this field, even in less affluent societies. And they overlap a lot. They have many different names. They overlap a lot, and they have somewhat different focus. Some would be values education. Some would be life skills for peace, conflict resolution skills, tolerance, human rights, humanitarian action and norms, civic education at national level, and international structures and processes. And since we have Carolyn Ashton here, I will mention to you what we mean by humanitarian action and norms, because she's just prepared a booklet on the subject for low-resource primary schools, which is based on stories of, going back to Solferino, in fact, from the Battle of Solferino, how you developed the Geneva Convention, the first Geneva Convention, and the Red Cross, one of the first humanitarian NGOs, and how much has grown from that. So this is a nice thing you can tell in a low-resource classroom using stories and kind of engage the students' emotions. So this is a first, because at this moment, humanitarian education internationally is guided. It's undertaken at secondary level, if at all, and it's guided by something from the ICRC, which is this thick, weighs 3 kilograms, and uses basically videos and highly skilled teachers. So we've gone for something, my organization was involved, we've gone for something low tech, just a little booklet, stories, and we hope that people will take an interest in that. And we consider it should be part of peace education, citizenship education, etc. Humanitarian action and norms means caring about people who you don't know, who are in trouble, essentially. The norms part includes international humanitarian law. And there is indeed another meeting going on today in The Hague about how the work of the International Criminal Court, especially with child recruitment and so on, could be brought into this whole arena. And they want to work with education ministers from the States Party to the international, to the Hague, to the Rome Statute, to introduce education for justice and peace. So there are all sorts of initiatives, and the perspective in this book is they should come together in a holistic framework. They should be a spiral curriculum going from basic principles for the younger children through to the different focuses of attention at the higher levels of schooling. And that's basically a spiral curriculum. You reinforce it throughout schooling. It must be systematic, and it should be an essential part of a dimension of education. These are aspects of how you would deal with the subject matter, teaching about the past in any of these themes, the local, national, global dimensions, gender, sustainable environment. Obviously, you know, in terms of civic concern, citizenship, the environment is important. Conflict resolution, the environment is important. So these things are cross-cutting. So it's a big lot of stuff. And this picture is to remind us that we're talking about how do we do this in places where you don't have much resources except students and teachers who are, you know, willing, but themselves not very well trained. So we've talked about what, now we're coming to how. How do you teach so that the children themselves, the students, and in teacher training, the teachers, are changed or develop in a way which we want with the values and attitudes that support responsible citizenship and peace. And that's a challenge in any country. Now in rich countries, you get the kids to do stuff on the internet and do their own project and stuff like that. You can't do it if you're in a rural school in a poor country. If you've got conflict-affected, fragile state, it's worse. To involve the students personally, you have to have, we've simplified it, of course, there's a simplification, stimulus activity, followed by class, well-facilitated class and peer discussion. And that's a problem. Even if you teach teachers in a refugee camp how to do this, some of them will find it difficult to facilitate class discussion because they're used to very top-down teachers telling people what's what. So you need a lot of teacher training. You need to support the teachers. This is generalizing from the case studies and experience. You need to support the teachers indefinitely with mentoring and teacher training and moral support, so that when people say this is not important or this is too sensitive, they say, no, we have to do it. They need structured lesson guides and resources. To the extent possible, the community, the parent-teacher association, etc., should be supportive or aware. The societal environment, I feel very strongly that a multi-channel approach is good and that we should involve radio and so on. And then I'm sure you've been, if you work in education, you've come across this discussion. Do we quietly put good things into all the subjects and hope that the children will come out as good citizens, or do we label it? And where there has been the few cases where people have discussed this in terms of actual programs, if the subject is not well labeled, that this is a subject which is affecting you personally and your identity and your values and how you're going to live your life, then the students will just think it's part of school. And this was a story, this was a game. So everything turns on labeling and well-facilitated discussion so that the students themselves are changed. And that takes time. So it's very funny that the cheapest thing and the most important thing is to get, say, 1 period a week on the timetable to do this. If it's a standalone subject, that's the very best. Even if it's in another subject, such as social studies, which is often a practical approach, then if you can't kick something out, you've got to give extra time so that they can cope with this and have discussion. Now how at the policy level? So this book sort of invents 3 categories of approach. One is intensive, one is wide coverage, and one is policy-led. And essentially we're saying, if you have kind of a pretty captive group and a lot of resources and skilled training, you can do good stuff, you can do everything. You can really change people's lives. If you have a vast country and you're trying to reach all the students, then you have to use a different approach, which might be textbooks, for example. And another approach is a kind of mixture which is led by policy, where the government sets a policy and then various actors kind of support that policy. So starting with intensive, this is where I came in 1997, and I initiated or facilitated the startup of a peace education program in the refugee camps in Kenya. And it was like a pilot program, and UNHCR paid for peace education teachers, for resources, for trainers of trainers, mentoring, etc. UNHCR said we'll have one extra period a week. And this was like to see if it could be done under low resource situations. And we had a positive evaluation from a lady who had worked not with UNHCR but with UNICEF, who didn't believe in this project. And when I heard she was going to do the evaluation, I was horrified. This was after I'd retired. And somebody else in the top of UNICEF then said that he would eat his hat if she gave a positive evaluation. And she gave a positive evaluation. So those materials became eventually what's called the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies Peace Education Program, and it's been adapted in various ways in different places. This is from Qatar, a nice picture to show that you have to work hard at developing the teacher competencies and developing structured materials to support the teachers. Here's some more examples of intensive option. One of the captive audiences is teacher colleges, and UNICEF in Sierra Leone sent the consultant who'd actually worked on the UNHCR program for 6 months to work with the teacher education colleges and to produce a compulsory module called Emerging Issues, which covers the peace education agenda and how to teach with active learning and some other things that were deemed important in Sierra Leone. And each of 3 years there's a compulsory module on that, which is examined and which is also available by distance learning. So that is a captive audience, and the teacher trainers were trained by the consultant, and hopefully it's still going ahead. The INE program was also taken up for returnee secondary schools in Burundi through an NGO as part of the civics curriculum, which they didn't actually have much by way of civics textbooks. So that was following the same method, with training the teachers for 2 weeks in each of 3 successive school vacations and providing structured materials and so on. And they had an evaluation which was quite good. Another example, which is described in the book, is from Surya Sadid's Help the Afghan Children NGO in secondary schools, grade 7 at the moment in Afghanistan. And they have a method based on a storybook, 10 episodes, you can find it online, of a story of an Afghan family which is adversely affected by war. And it doesn't actually say anything political, but hidden behind it teaches the skills for coping. But hidden behind it all is obviously the fact that this family's life is really, really difficult because of war. But no one can deny it, whatever your religious beliefs and so on. So whether that, she's hoping to build that up to a comprehensive secondary peace education program in Afghanistan, if she can get resources. USIP was involved in this program also. To build it up nationwide, they would have to involve other NGOs, and they'll need funding to make that happen. And then I mentioned already the Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent has a peer education, which again is an intensive 5-day training for volunteers who work for them in different countries. Sri Lanka has a different approach, 200 pilot schools, where they're really trying out everything they can think of that promotes education for social cohesion. So that's the captive audience approach. Now take the example of Nepal. In Nepal, this is one of the models that I really preach. UNICEF, the Ministry of Education, Save the Children, and in fact UNESCO prepared a 5-year agreement, memorandum of understanding, to work together to revise the social studies curriculum so that each year it had a unit on peace, human rights, and civics. And this is how you can move things forward if you can get the high-level buy-in. And incidentally, that the UNICEF lady insisted that marginalized groups came in to help define the curriculum. Standalone textbooks were prepared in Sri Lanka with the support of Save the Children on citizenship, governance, etc. We have in the book a section on textbooks and other learning resources. The lady had prepared teacher guides for Somali textbooks with people from the 3 parts of Somalia to include the peace dimension. But that was after they'd done the textbooks, so it's not so systematic in the textbooks. And personally, I never believed in teacher guides because I've never seen teachers with teacher's guides, but it's an approach. And she also illustrates from Tajikistan that she worked with them to develop criteria for selecting textbooks for primary school reading materials that the Tajik specialists mentioned as a key criterion that the pro-social, pro-citizenship type behaviors. So then we come to what I call the policy leadership option. Carolyn Pontefract writes in the book about the situation in UNRWA schools, Relief and Works Agency, Palestinian refugees, in what they call 5 sites, countries and sites. So they've had this for 10 years, but they had an evaluation recently and they're upgrading it. And so their position, she emphasized very much that we go for the importance of policy. And then they're putting together more resources than they had before, and they will try to achieve quality. This, I know very little about this except from reading about it, but I'm very struck with what I've read for Colombia, that they have a national citizenship competencies framework. They have some laws as well, which support this, and then a competencies framework which tells you for each year of schooling the skills which the children should have. And they're very much oriented to peace, living in peace in their communities, and coping. But they called it National Citizenship Competencies Framework. And frustratingly, it's in Spanish and not available. But I think it's a model for the world, because what's happened is that NGOs and academia and municipalities have come in and helped schools in particular areas to achieve those competencies to a considerable standard. And in Sri Lanka, they put together a kind of policy which summarized all their activities, but they didn't perhaps implement it as a policy very much. So, in summary, the what? Holistic approach to the content, not going to the ministry one day saying we want peace education, next day somebody comes and says we want human rights education, next day somebody comes and says we want education for justice and peace, etc. Holistic, both for practical reasons and for reinforcement of the messages. We digest it before the students get it, and we give it to the students in a way which is self-reinforcing. We need to, at the classroom level, we must have a lot of work to train the teachers and build the materials. At national level, the policy must be supported by people from all persuasions, otherwise it will last as long as the government, and with a change of government or minister it will die. We need the collaborative arrangements with expertise through Save the Children, UNICEF, etc., some such arrangement, or through academia if they have relevant experience. We need we can combine these approaches so that we have a clear policy, we have a simple approach to wide coverage through insertion of materials into textbooks, and we have intensive elements where we have the possibility of them, which is teacher training, NGOs working in a particular location, this type of thing. And we're talking about a generation of teachers and a generation of students. Anything less is not worth thinking about. This is what it looks like when you've done some such stuff, the intensive work in Colombia. How can we self-organize to support this agenda? I've spoken with several of you, and you've all got tremendous expertise. And can we start a dialogue and build a community of practice and involve key actors to take this seriously, because at the moment it's not seen as serious. Can we help countries which are already doing things in this area to have to further develop their capacity and to undertake evaluations? The evaluation I saw from Nepal, it's not a very strong evaluation. You have to put more money and more expertise to get a good evaluation. There's a lot of initiatives going on relating to education and peace building. UNICEF is supporting initiatives with Dutch security money in 14 countries. The Global Partnership for Education, which used to be called the Fast Track Initiative, is starting to work to fund education in fragile states, and is also looking for conflict-sensitive approaches to education in fragile states. That's with 19 countries coming up to 22 next year. And the International Criminal Court Hague Municipality Initiative I mentioned, Education for Justice and Peace. All these things are happening, and can we involve countries, not all the countries that are in these activities, but those where there's an interest already at ministry level. Donors are crazy at the moment about literacy numeracy. They've discovered that if the children don't have textbooks and the teachers aren't trained and there's nothing for the children to read, they don't learn to read. And with this amazing discovery, every program now has a consultant to deal with literacy numeracy. And obviously they're going to say we need to have materials to read. So can we get the donors to fund the supplementary reading materials that have the global citizenship aspect and the life skills? Brookings is working with a wider group on metrics, and they are looking at literacy numeracy. They want to know worldwide not only how many children are in school, but how many are learning to read. And so the question is, can they also help us think about how to evaluate soft skills and what skills would be meaningfully reported at global level and which would be appropriate to evaluate at national level. Can we develop examples of competency frameworks? Can we translate things like the Columbia National Citizenship competency materials? Because in a fragile state, you don't have time to start from scratch. You have to make everything locally appropriate, but you don't have time to start from scratch. You need a resource pack and look through it and then come up with your own stuff. Anything else? If you can, please stay afterwards. And I've got some papers here to get the email addresses of anyone who's interested in an email dialogue on this. And we also have more copies of the book and flash drives with the books on. So don't please just go away. Please come and socialize a little bit afterwards and see how we can move things forward. And please stay in touch with me by email, msinclair@educationaboveall.org.
Great, thank you, and thank you very much, Margaret, not only for your presentation, but the work in organizing this and helping to develop what has the potential to be a very useful blueprint, I think, for educators, education organizations, and also giving people a sense of connectivity in this arena. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the work that the U.S. Institute of Peace has been involved in as a way to link to some of the issues that Margaret raised and some of the conclusions that have emerged from this study. I will defer to Qamar to talk about a number of our programs in education focused on education in Muslim communities directly that he's been involved in. But we've been involved in education going back well over a decade. This institution actually began with an education mandate. And so education has been a very important part of our work. But it really began to transform after the end of the Cold War, when we began to, in our work here at the Institute, get more and more involved in peace processes and post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization after peace. And it was our belief fairly early on that education could play a very important role in complementing the overall goals of a peace process within a particular national context. And many of the issues and conclusions that Margaret has raised were very much related to many of the challenges that we have tried to work on. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the specifics that we've dealt with. And one of the initial challenges, to be quite blunt about it, was how do you really infuse the term, the concept, peace into education? And, you know, I certainly appreciate the fact that this began as a project that did focus on peace education and has ended up in using civic education because it is more holistic. Peace as a concept, peace is controversial. It can be and has been politicized. And so this holistic approach is particularly important because you need entry points into education as a way to have an impact on curriculum or learning that is not going to be polarizing. And this is important because one has to think about the nature, the different challenges that societies face. And in our work, we have focused on and worked in societies that are in different states. They may still, conflict may still be ongoing. If you look at a lot of the work in the Israeli-Palestinian context, there's an ongoing conflict. If you look at a country like Libya, in Libya, for the most part, they were beginning from scratch. We got requests in the summer of 2011 from the transitional government in Libya, which literally asked the question of us, what do we do about education? The regime is gone. Children have not been in school. What do we do? What steps do we take? What should the curriculum be? There's been almost a lost year of schooling. Do we condense a year, 2 years into one? What should we emphasize? How do we incorporate the new values that we want to incorporate into our society, into the curriculum? Who should the teachers be? Who should the principals be? And so these are fundamental questions literally about building education back up, in which at that time there was no Ministry of Education. In other circumstances, you've got situations where you have a Ministry of Education, but the society itself may still be polarized. It's very difficult oftentimes to work at the top level because of the difficulties, the difficult political decisions that revolve around education. Because education is very much representative of the future, the long-term future, the values of a society, and how do they get incorporated into what happens in the classroom. So part of what we have done in our work is, for the most part, try to work at the local level to help build up capacity at the local level so work that's being done can be incorporated up from bottom to top. And part of that, and I like the fact that the Columbia model has been cited. Also the Northern Ireland model, which is a little bit different. Those both reflect bottom-up approaches that have that served as model that could be incorporated and then scaled up at a much greater level. And absent effective processes of reform, effective education ministries, those are the entry points that are important to look at. And there are a number of issues to consider. One is programs that can effectively address controversial issues. So the pedagogy, the teaching, is particularly important in, if you will, creating ways to show that controversy can be dealt with safely in the classroom. But not just safely, but in a way that it benefits learning and education. Almost every organization that we have worked with, no matter where it is, their success depended upon staying true to a mission of education. That is, helping the student learn. That the student is going to learn more, be better educated as a result of whatever it is, whether it's global education, peace education, whether it's something more holistic. But the ultimate bottom line objective has to be education. That's how you sell it. And that's how you begin to bring in the parents and the community so that it becomes incorporated into a community, and the community has an investment, because then it has a future payoff. And so that becomes particularly important. It's also important to realize that in many societies where you have different communities that have been in conflict with each other, or there has been significant repression in a society where equal access or equity has not been available, education is oftentimes viewed as a symbol of repression. So one has to almost sort of step back and make education viewed as something different within the community. And that's part of why investing in local teacher training, local ownership of learning and education becomes particularly important. A lot of this we found in a place like Sudan, that education also played an important role in public discussion of critical issues. That and many educators, this is also important to remember, that education is not an area that is confined to the school, confined to the academy, but that many educators, particularly those who are working to promote values of peace, tolerance, human rights, etc., many of them are what we would call dual-hatted. They are working both as teachers or in an academic environment, but they also are oftentimes working in NGOs or in civil society. So there's oftentimes a sort of public component to what the education role is. And in many cases, and this is what we're seeing increasingly in the area of healthcare. Healthcare, increasingly people in healthcare organizations are looking to education as a way to broaden the reach of information about public health, good health, good health care, good health, how people can improve how they live their lives in a more healthy way. So we need to remember and emphasize the intersection of broader public needs and education as well. It's also important to remember and think about societies that are in processes of reconciliation. That is, to what degree can education complement attempts at reconciliation, particularly dealing with a contested past, in order to get people to believe in a shared future. So this is where the role of history becomes particularly important. The fact that controversial issues can be discussed, analyzed in a safe way, and that is essential teaching, pedagogy, that becomes where education plays a particularly important role. Finally, I'll just end with an example of a program that is really become quite successful, but models much of what we have tried to do in many different areas. Our first, if you will, effort at having an impact in working with educators in Iraq, going back 8 years now, was a request from universities that were just being stood up again in Iraq to help create a human rights curriculum. Human rights was certainly not a topic that was taught in universities in Iraq. So we began to work with a number of universities and had faculty workshops with faculties from political science, law, education, etc., from a number of different universities in Iraq. Out of that came some initial courses on human rights, but they were somewhat marginal. Human rights remained a controversial topic, and there began to be a recognition that you couldn't relegate human rights just to post-secondary education at the university level. That was not going to really provide broader access to a community that was going through so many different political changes. So you had to think about spreading the issue more broadly. So we helped stand up and support a human rights center at the University of Baghdad. And they began to see where they could make a difference was actually in secondary school education. So it became more of an education focus. And as I mentioned at the beginning, and I think is what this study shows, is that then it's important to broaden out. Don't get restricted to human rights, which is, it can be controversial, it can be politicized. And so what emerged, working with local partners, first at the university level and then through civil society organizations that we help expand into, we focused on civic education. Civic education that we began to bring together teachers, academics, those who are doing teacher training through civil society organizations to develop a civic education curriculum, keeping the Ministry of Education in Iraq informed. We wanted to bring them in earlier to get their involvement, but because of the political nature of these, there's ministries of education move slowly. And so we had to show that this was going forward and that it was both successful and that you could have an expanded concentric circle of buy-in. And over time, it really began to flourish and develop, and a curriculum was created so that just recently, not only has the Ministry of Education made a commitment to supporting the curriculum, but will in fact, at their expense, publish 300,000 copies of the curriculum that was developed, written, and designed by coalitions of Iraqi educators. And in this civic education, that is where both issues of peace, human rights, responsibility, and how to deal with controversy is incorporated. Along with that, teacher training. And so the second part is standing up or expanding existing teacher training models that have been piloted in Iraq. We think this can have a great reach into Iraq, but this was a project that developed over 7.5, 8 years. So it does not move fast, but to really embed something in the education in a deep way, that's the kind of combined, holistic, bottom-up, ultimately top-down, and long-term investment that we think is modeled in this study, and that we think in different local contexts may in fact have a lot of payout. So thank you.
So I'd like to turn now to some of the work that the Brookings Institution is doing in this area.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you for having me here, and thank you so much to Margaret and the fellow panelists here. So I'll do three things today. I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. I also want to give you all some background on Education First, the UN Secretary General's initiative, and some more in-depth view into what we're doing with the Learning Metrics Task Force, which Margaret mentioned. So at the center, we are doing research with the aim of having policy impact, and we're always focused on learning for all, every kid in school and learning. That runs through everything that we do. We have three different research streams. The first is around education and resources and finances and how to make sure that education moves through systems most effectively with the highest possible impact on learning outcomes. Also thinking about how to bring in corporate actors to the space and to do so strategically. A second research stream that we have is education for the marginalized. And we have a particular focus on education for conflict-affected children and learners. And within that, we are doing some work right now on teacher compensation systems. We have an event coming up on that with a focus on several country cases, including Afghanistan. And we also do some policy advising, working with bilaterals, GPE, and others who are doing work in this space on fragility and conflict. Within that, we also do work on girls' education. Some of my colleagues are here today through the Global Scholars Program. They're visiting with us from their countries. We have from India and Ethiopia here with us today, Urvashi and Abraha, my colleagues, who are doing work on particular local issues on girls' education. Our last research stream is one that we're very focused on at the moment and relates to the theme, is the post-2015 agenda. And it's a particularly exciting moment in time in the sense that we're coming up to the sunsetting of the 2015 goals, and there are many ongoing discussions at different levels with the Sustainable Development Goals panel, conversation ongoing, UNDP consultations at country and thematic level. And so it's an opportune time to build messages and feed those messages into those ongoing discussions. And of course, that relates to what we're talking about today. So to give a little bit of the background of how we began doing work in this space, about a year ago, we launched a report called the Global Compact on Learning. This was done through a very collaborative effort with inputs from over 80 different stakeholders, probably some who are here. This report really focused on the crisis in education, which is both about children not being in school or dropping out of school, but also about the fact that so many children, the most recent estimate is 230 million, are not learning. And we've done some deeper looking into this issue and have found just the extremes of this issue. So for instance, in Africa, we're finding that over 40% of children are not learning, which means that even though they're spending 4, 5, 6 years in school, they're taking tests and their scores are just as bad as if they had randomly guessed. So we have so much work to do in this area, and the report details that and is based on the evidence, and also points towards the need to focus on early learning, foundational skills in primary, and post-primary transitions in particular. So as this report came out, a variety of actors who were involved and had given inputs took up some of the recommendations, and that's led to some of our work in various areas, including we serve with UNESCO's Institute for Statistics as the co-secretariat for the Learning Metrics Task Force, which is a high-level panel that has the remit of coming together to make recommendations about a goal for learning that can be included in the post-2015 agenda. I'll tell you more about that in a later part. We're also doing some research through the Research Task Force, which was convened based on the idea that there really isn't enough evidence about learning, and we need to build an agenda and bring actors in to do more work on what works to improve learning outcomes. And I think it's important to think about how this work really ties to the conversation today. And education, we've heard from Margaret and from Jeff, is the vehicle by which many of these values and the worldview can be instilled. In so many places, education is the main interface that young people have. And so it becomes so critical to think about what the messages are that's going through the education system. But also as it relates to learning, if the children aren't learning basic skills in school, they're not going to have the competencies to take in some of these messages. And so all the more reason that learning at a fundamental level needs to occur so that these children can even begin to read the text and can begin to develop the problem solving and the critical world views in order to absorb these important messages that will help them be a part of the global community. So turning to education first, as part of our policy advising, we've worked with the UN Secretary General's office, and we're a part of some very exciting events up in New York a couple of weeks ago to launch this important initiative. And what this is really is a reflection of the Secretary General's belief and understanding that education needs to be front and center in the next set of goals, that we need to push much further in order to achieve what we set out to achieve, and that we need many more actors. And also fundamental to his belief is that we do know what we need to do in education. I think that's very much parallel to what Margaret is saying, and a really important message. We do know what we need to do, but now we need political will. We need people to come together. We need to spur new resources. And we need to have a common message. So his initiative will focus on three things: access, quality, and global citizenship. In terms of access, there's a big push now to close the gap on the goals in the next 3 years. So he will be taking trips, delegations going to countries where there's a high burden of children out of school, and meeting with heads of state and others who can think through what are the challenges and make commitments, and then he will be meeting with donor countries as well to try to bring the global community together to help close that gap. In terms of quality, a lot of that discussion is now happening and will feed into the global goals going forward, but there's also a lot of momentum in those conversations, not only to talk about access, but also to talk about quality. Now, the third area, global citizenship, as Margaret mentioned, this really came out of the Secretary General's personal experience growing up in war-torn Korea, where he had the opportunity to be educated in great part due to the international community, the United Nations and UNICEF, which was helping to provide education. And so he has a deep-rooted belief that global citizenship will help to provide education that is elevating the view of children so that they realize the world that they're in and can contribute to that world. This really relates to some of the 21st century challenges that we do have, where we have pandemics that run from one country across to the other, conflict bleeds across borders, and so it becomes so vital that we do have this greater view of the world around us. And some of the barriers that are noted in the Education First concept note, which is online, globaleducationfirst.org, if you want to read more about the initiative, are many of the same that we've talked about today, including the legacy of the education system, outdated curricula, the need to better train teachers, and also noted in there is a lack of leadership around this issue and the need to regularly assess. So I would contest that this leadership is there, and it's more now a question of building momentum, and I think that's part of what Margaret is helping to do today. So there are 10 key actions within the report. One of those is to foster global citizenship. And the report talks about cultivating a sense of community and active participation within those communities, and ensuring that schools are free of discrimination in all forms. So the main thing that I wanted to say about that today is I think it is really an exciting time. Never, in my memory anyway, has there been quite the level of commitment around education from the United Nations. It's a moment where all the agencies are coming together under one initiative. There's a good deal of attention, and most importantly to this conversation, the concept is in the bigger initiative, but exactly how it will be addressed is not yet defined. And I think that's what's special about this particular moment and this conversation and this material, and especially the message that we know how to do this, and now we need to rally the will. So I think that's exciting and something to be taken advantage of. So I'll tell you now a little bit about the Learning Metrics Task Force, and this I think it can be helpful in this conversation because it's an example of a very tangible step to try to move forward the post-2015 conversation around education. This focuses on learning, but as we've seen, learning and global citizenship really go hand in hand, and each needs the other in the most fundamental way. So this task force, it's broadly representative. The people who are on it bring in their own constituencies, and it's meant to be a very consultative piece of work that tries to answer three different questions. What should be measured globally and nationally? How should these competencies be measured? And then how can that be implemented? The task force meets 3 times. It had its first meeting in September, another in February, and then another in June. Supporting each of these 3 questions and each of these 3 meetings are technical working groups that are looking very deeply, reviewing policy, reviewing international conventions, and also bringing in a tremendous amount of feedback, doing consultations. So in the first round, we talked with over 400 different people, the majority of them from the Global South, and reviewed a tremendous amount of documentation and came up with a set of 7 competencies that the working group recommended to the task force, and the task force reviewed. So these 7, they're being referred to as domains. These 7 different domains, I'll read them out to you, and I want to highlight that 2 of them do relate specifically to global citizenship. And global citizenship is a concept that was very much in mind, along with other concepts, as documents were reviewed and as consultations were done. So the different domains are naturally literacy and also communication, numeracy and mathematics. I mentioned those first because those are sort of the fundamental learning-based domains that we think of first. Learning approaches and cognition, science and technology, physical well-being, and related to global citizenship, social and emotional, learning and culture and the arts. The task force had to debate a variety of different questions. The first being, do we go for a very robust idea of education, inclusive of important concepts like global citizenship, even if in some cases we're not sure whether or not it's going to be feasible to measure these, or we just don't know how yet? And the task force came out with a feeling that let's include everything, let's put it back to the technical working groups and see what they recommend about how these different domains should be measured, but let's go for a more robust version of learning and put that forward. And if anything, if there are practical considerations, we can continue to have a high-level view about what should be included. There were some other very interesting debates, and I mention these also in order to encourage you all to share with us your thoughts and your input. Consultation is going on continuously, and today, even in your questions, I'll be noting the areas of interest and places where people would like to provide feedback. So one very interesting debate has been, should we focus on children who are inside the school and measure their learning outcomes, or should we focus on all children? It's very difficult because in order to measure, if you go to the school level, it's going to be much more cost effective because you have children in a set environment and you already have information on record for them. The challenge, and particularly relevant to the fragility context where so much of this work with global citizenship will happen, is that sometimes those who really need it most are out of school. And so by measuring those who are in school, you're privileging the population that has the means and the time to get their children into school. Another debate is who's going to be accountable for this measurement, and I think that's really interesting in the context of this conversation as well. Should it be governments? Should this be something that happens only at the policy level? Governments measure student outcomes in school, or do we actually need much more robust involvement? Do we need to find a way that an international goal brings in the international actors like the IRC or Save the Children and the communities themselves so that everybody has a stake in what the goals are? And in the context of this conversation, of course, in some places, for instance, in northern Uganda, where I did my doctoral research, as Lily mentioned, the strength of the state is not, it doesn't have reach into all of the communities. And if it has an adult literacy program to reach the millions of youth and adults who are out of school and returning to their homes with very little support, that program is a fraction of a % of an education budget. So there's no way that the school system is going to be able to provide to those who actually need it most, those who missed 2 decades of school and are just trying to put their lives together. And it's a population that's very important in the peace building context. So how do we involve other actors as well? So this, again, is another debate that they're having. There's also a question about, should measures be global or should they be national? I think so far the beginning feeling is that there's some that can be global, for instance, literacy and numeracy. There are others that maybe it's more important to have at the national level. That will be debated and discussed in the more technical working groups. But again, I think it's interesting to think about. And today we've heard the theme of the importance of local processes and how programming and priorities can be developed from the ground up so that they're most relevant. And so it becomes a question of how then do you fold all of that in. And I also am convinced of the importance of that because context can be so different. And in Uganda, where I was working with youth, what they were most looking for, their priorities, were very different from the youth that I know in Malawi. So in Uganda, they were just very interested in the very, very basics of being brought together so that they could have a form of interacting with each other around a constructive end. And through that, they could build their social network and relationship and feel that they had a community within northern Uganda, and that would feel like peace. And if they could do that, then at some point they could tackle the bigger piece and begin to think about their place within the bigger Uganda. In Malawi, on the other hand, the girls that I work with who are coming to school, secondary school, for the first time out of a rural context, they may have never left the rural context. The school is the agent that's bringing them into a much more global in their world. It's really regional, bringing them in together, and now they need to make the mental leap to understand how they relate to Malawi as a country, because for the first time they're being brought into a system that takes them out of their local communities and homes. So they're very different needs, but of course both within the realm of global citizenship, and of course they have different needs within learning as well. And the last debate that I'll mention is about equity, and of course this relates to the fragility context in the sense that the first set of MDGs and access, one of the things that we've learned is that if you don't put in provisions for equity, there's a bias towards bringing the children into the program who are easiest to reach. Those who are hardest to reach, there may be more resources involved. But if you put a bias in place and don't reach them, then you're actually increasing the potential for grievances and structural inequalities within the system. So how can that be countered? Could countries, for instance, be measured not only in absolute terms, but also in terms of changes in equity that are positive? So in terms of next steps, consultations are ongoing November through January, and then there'll be another meeting and another set of consultations. If anyone is interested in giving feedback and holding a consultation with any constituency that you may have, please get in touch with us. And I also just want to encourage this group to meet with Margaret, think with Margaret. How can global citizenship be brought into this conversation? How can there be a common voice around what needs to happen for global citizenship? And how can this message that it's feasible, it's affordable, it can be done, and this is how it's done, how can that be elevated in the global conversation? Thank you.
So thank you so much, and I think we'll now move from the sort of very macro level, policy level discussion to a more micro level discussion of a specific program for a specific type of school and how USIP has developed this program and our experiences in implementing it.
Thank you, Lily. Good morning. I'm going to share some of my work on working with religious schools in Muslim-majority countries, and 4 of them, and just some of it will actually contradict what my colleagues are saying, so that's not on purpose. It's just to show you the sort of tensions that exist in within this field of peace studies, peace education, and global peace education, and of that in this field generally. And so I like to do 4 things and hopefully navigate you through these 4 topics, subtopics. One is addressing religious schools. How do you address it within this field? How does one go about it? Some of the challenges one faces, and what is the local NGO communities doing that I've studied in Muslim majority countries, and then moving specifically on religious schools, Muslim religious schools in communities, and how they have adopted, transformed themselves with peace studies and peace education, and then come back to the macro. That's what I like to do in this 15, 16 minutes. I think it's probably a fair assessment to say that religious actors, religious institutions are very strong civil society members. In many places, in majority of conflict zones, they are the leaders in hospitals and schools, humanitarian work, disaster relief. This is not it's not a bold statement, but it's a fact in many conflict zones. However, when we deal with religious schools, and they exist, a variety of them, they are probably the last to be considered in the field. Perhaps the tension between our training, the field itself, or the relationship between religious, quote-unquote, religious schools and religious communities, and let's say the field of peace studies and conflict resolution. Now, when I refer to religious schools, broadly I'm speaking about all religious schools in Muslim majority communities that refer to Coptic schools, Islamic schools, Jewish schools, of course, Protestant, within Christians, we're talking about Protestant as well as Catholic schools. Then there's even more variations of Jesuit schools, friar schools, St. Mary's schools. There's all these different schools that exist, historically exist. The ones that I've been working with in the last 4.5 years is these Muslim schools called madrasas in South Asia, pasantrins in Indonesia, maktabs in other places, and also schools in Mindanao and Philippines. And I just want to first say some of the tensions or challenges that we've had. One is that we have to look at the post-9/11 context. A lot of these schools were under the microscope of security studies. So when we did want to work or think about religious schools, particularly Muslim religious schools, it was always through a security lens. How can we see what is the curriculum? How are they adding to intolerance? How are they contributing to radicalism? What is our national security? Not just for Western, but local states. So in Philippines, you've had an existing conflict between in Mindanao and in central state, and so the Mindanao schools were viewed as contributing to the conflict. Same in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Aceh, Indonesia. These schools were not viewed as how to absorb them and co-opt them, but also how do they add to our security or destabilizing factor. That was one of the major challenges. Until today, I think there's a great suspicion between education policymakers, so security policymakers, people in this town, and educators abroad who are not familiar with religious schools. Trying to navigate through this and trying to show through this that these schools, again, both overseas and here, the narrative was that the curricula uses pre-modern texts. It's non-inclusive. They have very little relevance to contemporary issues. There's no vocational training. The product is religious leaders who are outdated and cannot function in modern society. And the religious studies curriculum really don't prepare graduates to be interfaced with the rest of the world. Now, this is not just a commentary from security studies. This is a commentary within the NGOs, education NGOs in these states, Muslim majority communities, and also the ministries of education. Part of it, that many of these religious schools are very fiercely independent for many reasons, and some are not. And so there was a view from Ministry of Education that these schools, just leave them alone, and it's best to just observe them, but not even try to engage them in peace education or conflict resolution. So those are some basic obstacles. Not only did I have these obstacles within locally, but internationally and on the policy level. But they are, as described by colleagues there, fabulous NGOs on the ground working on every level on training teachers, creating manuals and guides and so forth. One of the issues is that in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Philippines, and Niger, that these are NGOs, of course, terribly dependent on foreign funding and so forth. So their thinking of peace studies and so forth is not really locally rooted. And so there's this emphasis on peace education, conflict resolution, but it's imported from Switzerland or the States. The actual curriculum, the actual thing. And it went through all these different manuals. It looked like something straight out of an NGO in Switzerland. And so you would ask, where would you get this? And it said, well, I was trained in an intensive seminar in country X in Western Europe or in DC or California, and so I brought this back. So this is what I'm trying to teach here. Again, that causes some tension because it's not really, there's no accommodation to the local culture and local habits and customs and thinking. So they're trying to do this within some religious schools and then wondering why it's not working. So we try to think about reframing the way they go about their engagement. And there's a lot of pushback within the NGOs. Again, the NGOs I'm talking about in Pakistan and Aceh and Afghanistan, Niger, and Philippines. And they said, look, when we start teaching about against prejudice, bigotry, discrimination, gender equality, and against provincial thinking, this is not something that you can push back and say, these are universal lessons. Well, why are you trying to accomplish? It's not just the lessons, it's just the way it's integrated in your teaching. It's the way it's integrated in cultural habits and customs. So we found that, and this is just one passing theme, many of the NGOs are operating on this belief that, and I think we take this for granted, that the individual has to be groomed to be an individual, but also a global citizen. Right? Self-responsibility, growth, individual aspirations, all this stuff that we think is common. But when you're in religious schools, the individual is not emphasized. It's the community that's emphasized. Not just you, but your responsibility to your denomination. Forget about the rest of the Islamic community, or forget about the rest of the province or the state. It's you and your particular sect. And so you are de-emphasized as an individual. And so you have this immediate problem of the NGO emphasizing individual aspirations and growth and contribution to the world and your individual personality and so forth. And this is not the culture within the pasantrins and madrasa. So I think that was something that I found interesting. One of the problems also I found in the sort of peace education manuals and the NGOs is that the donor-driven, but they very little work done on M&E, monitoring and evaluating their work. So they did the trainings, then pulled back. This is just, I guess, a problem in many places. They also, when the funding ran out, they didn't have a way to follow up. So many of the madrasas felt like we opened our doors or pasantrins to these NGOs. They came, and there was no follow-up. There was no interest in the institution, no investment in that institution. It was just one or two workshops, and that was it. What I was thinking before I got involved is to really study the curriculum of these Islamic schools, these madrasas, and pasantrins, and really study not just the text, but study teacher-student dynamics, culture, where are students coming from, what is the hierarchy within the schools as well as outside the schools. And I think that the hierarchy outside the schools is more important than inside the schools. That's one thing I learned. So it's not just the teachers and administrations, but it's the religious councils, these ulama councils, that have a great deal of influence on the curriculum, of course, on who's the teachers and the direction of these schools. Not only these councils, but then there's these various religious authorities, authoritative bodies, and so forth. So those have to be included So that was also something we needed to think about. What I'm suggesting here is that in this work, there were so many different subtexts and issues that I think the NGO communities were not interested in navigating through these different hierarchies. For instance, I observed one NGO in Afghanistan, and you have to imagine, like this room, if you divide up this room, this could easily be, if it's divided appropriately, maybe a classroom of 9. So if you divided it right, this could be 9 classrooms in a typical school. And so each classroom, there's no chairs, no desks, everyone sits on the floor, no carpet. So one is speaking about global responsibility, and I remember watching, and this one student asked the teacher, after being very respectful, what global responsibility means what? And she went on, didn't you understand what I just said? I mean, it's X, Y, and Z, and this is the manual, don't you see? And we're working through this, you didn't do the homework. And it was really interesting to watch this student, 14 years old, say, why are we worried about global responsibility when we don't have responsibility in our own province or in our own village? Why can't we have lights in our school? Why can't we have, paper and so forth? And so there was this disconnect, and I think it was a very interesting educational moment where students were asking, why should I be concerned about this very peaceful curriculum that is coming into our school, but we don't have the basic facilities? And I think it was a very important lesson for the teacher and for the NGO who was evaluating the project. One of the things we try to do is, when we started to work with particular madrasas, is start thinking about how structured that culture is and why would a peace education program be important. And when you ask that question, which is more results-oriented, you ask the administrators, right, and the religious leaders. So I have religious leaders, administrators of the schools, some scholars, national scholars, and we had a workshop discussing sort of these big macro questions. And I think they were very honest. We can't change the curriculum. The curriculum is over 600 years old. Okay? What you do at age 11 at 7 a.m. is the same what my father did and his grandfather did. And so it's the same for a 12-year-old at this grade, and after you finish this grade and this course, then you move on to this course and so forth. We can't change that. What we can do is, as I remember the conversation, we can change is certain aspects of the culture. And they were willing to change the way teachers interact with students, classroom management, communication, not only from up to down, but down up, meaning instead of up and down, maybe like a circle, equal space for discussions. Even a time allocated every day where a student can speak his or her mind on what's happening to what are the issues they have personally and educationally. So just all to say that that's the things we discussed. So the culture, the education culture, and then we went into pedagogy and how things are taught and the way things are taught. We can do all that. But one of the things I said is it possible for students to be teachers? Well, that's the other thing, that no teachers ever trained to be a teacher in these schools. They just become teachers. There's no teacher training institute for these madrasas or pasantras. They just become teachers. So we were hoping to have students between the ages of 15 and 19 who will be teachers in these schools to have the experience to be teachers, but through a classroom experience. So we asked, if there was a course where the students led the course and the teachers had to sit and not participate, is that possible? Oh, no, that's not possible. Our teachers are the authority. But we did develop a course, and they were very interested, and the team was built by both Sunni and Shiites who developed this course. And I just want to sort of contrast the manuals I saw with the NGOs teaching peace studies and the manuals that I've seen and we created for Islamic schools. So we loosely call it Islamic peace education. And the reason we call it Islamic peace education is because all these manuals that I've seen from the Philippines and the ones we created in Pakistan and Afghanistan is that there's several common trends and approaches. First, the text established philosophically and theologically, ethically, the principles of peace building. So it's working within a tradition. The first 2 chapters deal with peace building. They retrieve certain narratives from their own tradition, and it's inserted, and it's the base of all these manuals. Second, we find that it's very common to find, citations of scripture and histories of important saints and companions and prophets and so forth. That's all standard in these manuals. But what's interesting is what's extracted in these stories is these what they call spiritual lessons, or temporal dimensions of these lessons. So what should we learn from this? All of these students I've come across in madrasas and pasantrans, they have great memory because rote memorization is the method. But they don't understand the lesson from it. Right? They can cite a 13th century textbook, the Ghazali's Hayar-Dun, right? The book on this amazing theology from the 13th century, but what does that mean to today? So now they're trying to put lessons and what it means for today's existence. Third, we find that they contested the NGO version of what is peace. Peace was taught as absence of peace, structural peace, positive peace, negative peace, and those things. These manuals in Islamic peacemaking, they included it as saying these are some common theories, but within our Islamic notion, we think of a peace not only what Muslim jurists have said, that's fine, so they're trying to pay respect to the past and those folks, but there's an inner peace and an outer peace. And there's a big chapter on what inner peace and outer peace means. So there's a whole section dedicated to theology of peace, which I don't think it's a very important exercise for these teachers to write and then teach, and for these students to then talk about. Then there's all these other chapters that move into very specific. So I would say there's a theological theory, and then the rest of half of the manuals I've seen, and the second half is a praxis. Specific, it was very interesting. Chapters on just empathy, chapters on forgiveness, chapters on ethics of service, volunteerism, chapters stressing values of nonviolence and compassion, collaboration, understanding layers of justice, not justice like the global justice, but personal justice, interpersonal justice, communal justice, and so forth. Chapters dedicated to understanding what we would call collaborative conflict resolution, understanding past agreements by, let's say, the prophets and what they could mean in today. I'll just have one thing from his specific chapter. A chapter on dialogue. And what I mean by chapter, I'm talking about 12 to 14 pages, which is a discussion what dialogue is, the different methods of using it, implementations, and an exercise. Then the students have to do role playing, then come up with their own exercise, and then groups break up, and then they do their own work. And the teachers are just watching this. So what we're saying is there's a whole restructuring of classroom, the hierarchy within a madrasa pasantran that I think one would have said there would be a lot of pushback, but in fact it's been really received well. Chapters on listening, not lecturing, arranging proper time and space to resolve the conflict, what we call ripeness. So counseling to heal, not counseling to lecture, and many other chapters on reconciliation and thinking about hegemony of the voice and personalities. All this to say, I'm giving you specifics, I'm giving you chapters from the weeds from these religious schools, and just as an example of what is happening in some of these countries. At least 19 manuals in over 8 different countries, Muslim majority countries, and minorities coming from the Balkans, from Morocco to Indonesia, and just to sort of illustrate what something is happening to, right? But to share also that there is this disparity between the NGO world, the Ministry of education, religious affairs. There's just a lot of schisms within this field of education. And there needs to be more bridges made within the religious and so-called non-religious communities. Anyway, those are just some major points from my work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This gives us many different aspects of the challenges of implementing these particular kind of pedagogies. And I realize this event was scheduled till 11, and we're a little beyond that, but I think it's okay with USIP if we add on a few more minutes. Since no one's trying to chase us out, I actually would like to hear we'd like to hear some of your questions and thoughts. So we have mics, and if you could raise your hands and just introduce yourself briefly, tell us who you are. I think we'll bring the mics to you. We have, oh no, we don't, well, we can do roving mics? Yes, we do have a roving mic. So why don't I see a hand here, and then why don't we go to this gentleman, and one here, and one here. Why don't we try to collect 4? If you could keep your questions brief, we'll collect 4 and then try to turn to the answers. To the panel here for some answers. So why don't we go to this lady in the second row first? Oh, sorry, no, this lady first, and then to this gentleman.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on conflict resolution and violence prevention. Thank you for your wonderful discussion and talk. Just a comment and one question. What I wanted to say is, listening to you all, I'm a local small organization based here in the District of Columbia, and we are present in Kenya. Many big organizations like you don't want to work with small organizations and grassroots organizations. That's why there is conflict, there is a problem, you don't understand who know education. But if you are working with small organizations like me and rural area grassroots education to what you are all doing, I think the world would be a better world and people could understand what education is. Looking at education is the best thing to teach people. I come from Kenya. I'm an African woman born and raised in Africa. What I'm asking is, I heard about 40% of rural area of African children who don't go to school. African children go to school. What we don't have are the resources of teaching, training teachers, and how those children can be helped to get the education they want. But I believe Africans, just like me, are smart children who can get education. How do we collaborate with you people to get the message out there, to get them educated, and to get them know what we are talking here? Because they are not all here. I'm here listening, and I know what you are talking. So how can we collaborate with you people? And how do you take violence and resolutions together, and how can we resolve? My organization will be going to Kenya to observe the election. My nephew was killed in the post-election in 2007. How can you be part of the peacekeeping before the election and after the election and election violence prevention? Thank you.
Thank you. Pass the microphone to this gentleman back here.
Hi everyone, I'm Tariq Abdurrahman. I have the bachelor degree in education from Egypt. I studied in these non-observed schools that Kamal Huda talked about. Actually, first of all, I'd like to thank so much Department of State that gave me the chance to be here for 1 year as exchange visitor student, and special thanks to the United States Institute of Peace. And on the first time for me, after 7 years of graduation, to be in the right place, because you touched now all my feelings and my thoughts. At the moment, really, I'd like, if you don't mind, to share with you in a few seconds.
I'm sorry, we're actually really out of time technically, so could you just state the question?
In brief. Okay,
sorry, because a few more people want to get in and talk.
Yes, okay, thank you. I remember now what happened to the Pakistani 14 student who has been shot because of her interest in education, just because she dreams about education for all her mates. And really, I'm working in non-profit organization in Egypt for civic education. And my question is now, how can you, or in your opinions, as NGOs or international NGOs, how do you think about our Arabian world after the uprising now? How can you deal? How can you make a change for students? Honestly, I used to, when I was at the school, to underline all these messages, all these sentences that shouldn't be delivered to students because it has discrimination based on religion or sex. So I wonder, how can you collaborate with us? What's your opinion? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I believe this lady here, right in front of you. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Urvashi Sani, and I'm a global scholar at Brookings, but I live and work in India, so I'm a guest scholar here. Thank you very much for the panel. And what delights me is that the expansion of education is very close to my heart and my work, to include topics like peace education, human rights education, citizenship, because I think, as you said, to include the youth to contribute in this. It should probably make the stuff of the curriculum now, and that's where the curriculum should be moving everywhere. So thank you so much for that. My question is to you, Qamar. It was very insightful, your whole presentation. Congratulations on that. My question is that I come from a culture that believes in inner peace and outer peace, and my questions are really two. And in a communal definition of the self. So I understand that. But my question is that that is also a very oppressive force in cultures like ours, especially for women, particularly for women, where they are taught not to think of themselves, but only of the community and only of the family, and they're subsumed under that. That is one. And the second thing is that when you're talking about a curriculum for peace, I like the way you outlined it and that it should be from the bottom. But do you also include in that discussions around the role of religion as a catalyst of conflict? So when there are blasts, when there are things happening where they're really driven by religion, then in madrasas, is that one of the topics of conversation where you question it? When you question the religious texts and you question religion as being, in fact, driving conflict? That was my question.
Sorry, three pretty challenging questions. I think we're going to have to take those three and come back to the panel, because I've just been told actually they need to redo this room very quickly for another event. So we have really only like 2 or 3 more minutes. But who would like to take the questions about how international actors and large organizations with a lot of power, essentially in the form of resources, can work more effectively with small and local and grassroots organizations? Why don't we take that first and then move to the question which will, I think, goes to Qamar. Santi.
Thank you for your question, and we, I think, all want to encourage you on your very important work at Hope for Tomorrow. I think there are ways to collaborate. Sometimes perhaps they're not as transparent as we would like for them to be, but just to highlight a few, I know USIP has a grants program for organizations like Hope for Tomorrow or others who apply through a competitive process, and that helps a lot of organizations across the world doing grassroots work. And in our work at Brookings, we do a lot of convening and dialogue and research, and we certainly are always looking to collaborate with individuals like yourself, with organizations, bring diverse voices. So we certainly do our best, and I'd love to connect with you afterwards. And the large organizations as well, USAID, I was recently there for their All Children Reading Challenge, where they had selected organizations through a competitive process. Most of those were organizations that were getting grants from USAID for the first time, so small organizations. But I do think there's more to do, and having a voice and being a part of a dialogue to champion that is certainly a worthwhile thing, and something that we would support. Again, I think a lot of it comes down to the transparency of the opportunities that actually are there. So I think we can collectively do better to make those more known and build our networks abroad and here in order to reach grassroots organizations.
Thanks, Jeff. And Margaret, did you also want to address those two questions?
I'll just very quickly respond. We always work with local partners. And in fact, give me your card. We're doing some work on conflict prevention in Kenya, so perhaps I can link you up with some folks here working on that. Secondly, we do a lot of training in this institution, and one of our mantras to those who work for the larger international organizations is, in fact, it's important to do a local assessment, not only work with local partners, but don't just look for what we call the usual suspects. Because there are NGOs in local contexts who, in fact, make a business of appealing to what international donors are looking for. And we're trying to help those in the larger international organizations think outside what we call the usual suspects. So I think there's a lot more going on than you might realize.
Margaret, did you want to add anything? Okay, so I think, Qamar, you have the last word.
Thank you. Just a quick response, because I see the pressure to leave. But I can come, if you're here, I'd love to continue the conversation. Just as a point of fact, that when I was mentioning religious schools, I meant both men and women, girls and boys schools, right? Boys and girls schools, madrasas and so forth, teachers, both men and women. And even when I refer to religious leaders, I'm surprised how many people think I'm just talking about men. I actually mean both men and women in these communities. So having both men and women around the table and working on such projects, I don't think we have the question of where is religion contributing. The voices are who's doing what. So it's like particular sects, particular individuals, and then becomes politicized. Well, this is, funded by so-and-so group and so forth. But I think what we're doing is what you said, which is the culture of questioning of where things have been, why institutions are where they exist. And I think that's what we're installing in sort of these workshops. I don't think going at it and say religion is a source of problem with two religious communities is a helpful question. It's how you frame the question makes all the difference, I think. So we do get to the questions of religious violence, obviously, but it depends on how you frame the question. We do deal with it. We deal with it, yes.
Thank you all very much, and thank you to the patience of our events team, too. Thank you all so much for coming, and to our panel as well.
Can I just mention?
Yeah.